Hello, welcome back to Jordan's Mix Vlogs. Today we are going to do a mix analysis of my song titled Doctor or I Have Something Wrong with My Brain, suiting title. So for this mix, I broke down the sections into four groups. We have vocals, kick, and percussion. I chose to separate the kick and percussion due to the processing I needed to do needed to be very different, being a song that is kick driven and very, very kick driven. Had to process them differently. I could have subgrouped them in here, but just a personal choice, I guess. Also, different leveling. I got to, I had more room for leveling. You see this -6, this -4 that moves around a tiny bit at the end, and we have synths down the very bottom. So in the vocals, we'll start with the group. We have a completely dry reverb that only comes in the builds just to help build intensity. And for the input of the reverb, I've made the focal point being vocals have made the focal point around the 1000, 4000, 5, 6 upper range. And a lot of diffusion. And I've only done it in the high end, probably more so than I needed to, but I've done it in the high end to try and emulate a natural sounding reverb as much as possible. And that being that high frequencies travel less different distance, so they diffuse faster when sound travels. And high density. And the only reason that density is quite high is because I really wanted it to bleed out within the mix as it's coming in, and that tail to be more prominent. The EQing just found the nice range that I wanted, dipped out, I think around the 400 hertz mark. That looks like, and I've done that just because it gets quite busy around the 400 hertz mark and 200 hertz in this mix, and most of the mixes I do. In some cases, 1000 can get quite busy. And if you're not careful and paying attention with the channels that you're putting in, your low end can get quite messy as well. So always pay attention to that. This fade to gray, which is just a reverb and a delay at once, which works simultaneously as you turn this knob. So it's good fun. It gives a very good washed out feel and disorientates where the sound is coming from as it builds in. As it builds up, I should say, and then some more spatial dynamics with modulation. So for the first vocal channel, we have just a sample that was given to me, sorry, with this little plugin, which is a bunch of plugins in one, essentially. You got transposition, and what this formant um knob does is it's essentially got a built-in vocoder, and the more you put of that, it vocodes to the best way to explain it is as you go down, it makes it more of a male sounding voice, and as you go up, it's more of a female sounding voice. So it it transposes as well as an external vocoder when this is purely just the vocoding of the input. And then on the side here, you just have compression, which is all done in parallel, meaning that you have a dry and wet signal, and you can find the balance between the two. And you can by doing this, you can really crunch that all the pots, and then still have the dry signal most dominant, and but hiding that underlying sound in the background, I suppose. And for the gate, I've got quite a high threshold in relevance to standard thresholds that I would put on a gate, and that's because the person who sent me this recording recorded it on his phone and was recording an old movie on a TV. So there was a lot of noise floor and a lot of clarity issues, which really didn't need to be there. But got a fast attack, a small return, just a little bit of space, but a longer release to try and emulate a natural sounding release of a voice as much as possible. Put a little bit of a tail on there without making it cut off too much. On the EQ, just found the frequency range I need, dipped out frequency that didn't need to be there or to help better fit in the mix. And then again, that reverb delay combination and compression. And all these channels are very much the same. as far as the gate and the compression goes and the plugins used. The only difference is EQing. And the reason that this has been done is to create a sense of relativity within the whole thing, like make it sound like one cohesive audio file rather than a bunch of chopped up files, which they are, but it just helps it sound like it's coming from the same distance, same mouth, same conversation essentially. Moving on from there, we have the kick, and I have these two EQs here because this one, bang, when the builds come or when the verses and the main parts of the song are gone, being such a heavy kick driven song, and it's a very bassy, meaty kick. This first EQ is just used with negative 48 dB high pass, just at about over just under 200 hertz to get rid of that thumping bass on it. So it's still there, and the pulse and the beat is there, but it's not carrying the song anymore. And then this second EQ that I have here is just to further sweep up as the intensity builds in the beat and makes it wash out a little bit nicer. And this glue compressor, just to help stick these two channels together, being that there is a kick and a sub bass, just helps control the levels equally. And this reverb, again, you can see just coming in at the build, becoming more intense. The input is focused on the low end, being that it is a kick and a sub bass. It's more low end, prominent, and a lot of diffusion on the high end because I really didn't want any of that to come through in the mix. Give a lot more space for other frequencies and whatnot. EQing on the kick itself, again, very simple, just dipping out that 400 hertz mark, giving room for the busy section. This sub bass here, what I've done is you can see that the frequency, the target frequency for this saturator is 1K, but you might think that because this EQ has already cut it out, that it shouldn't be there, but it just gives a very warm feeling, especially after cutting that out, saturating the 1K, and then boosting it a little bit with this overdrive. It creates it better tunes with the kick above. We'll just run through it. So first without, then with. So it just gives a little bit of that warmth and a little bit of that. It would sound much different if I were to leave that in. See, that warm feeling is still there, but it's just a lot less noisy and a lot cleaner, a lot more subtle, and some basic compression for leveling. Moving on to the percussion. On here again, you can see that I've just chosen the frequency range that I think is best for this. More of an appropriate diffusion as far as natural sounding reverbs go. And again, it's dry up until there to help wash it out. Oh, another thing I'll point out is the pre-delays. For a lot of the reverbs that I've used on separate channels in the builds, as it gets more intense, I start changing the pre-delays and making them all different. And so that way they really just start scattering everywhere and all the sound starts bouncing at really unpredictable, awkward times. And it gives a very good sense of misdirection as to where the sound is coming from. I know I've said that earlier, but it's a great technique that I always use. Two side chains. These are the same sample, but they're just compressed differently. And the reason for that being in the main section of the song, sections of the song, I will use this side chain here, which is a little bit more less intense, a little bit less compressed. And then when the main sections are over and it comes into the break or the build, I'll switch to this side chain, and that being it's a lot heavier, a lot louder, and has a much more obvious pulse to it when when the channel's being sidechained by this riser chain. I mean, it has a much bigger pulse to it. Moving on, another side chain down the end, completely different instrument this time, just have a different sound, different blend on the side chain. What do we have here? These are snares, I believe. And I think that, yeah, pitch bend inside of the MIDI block itself for both channels, appropriately panned, a little bit off center. Nothing too over the top. See, I didn't want to. Really didn't want to overdo this song. I try not to overdo a lot of my mixes. This is just, again, dipped out that 1K range just because there'll be vocals coming through here, but I didn't high pass it completely because I still wanted it to have some body whilst also getting rid of those harsh screeches in that range. Again, that reverse crash. Oh, I haven't explained that, sorry. So for this crash here, looking back on it, I probably could have done a reverse reverb technique on this just to help make it sound more natural building. And I've sidechained this to the sidechain channel, not the riser chain. And as you see, the sidechain channel will only begin giving input into this compressor on the drop itself. So and that's done simply because I want this reverse crash here to be very, very obvious and very prominent in the build, and then when the drop comes in, just to hide it away a little bit. So it still has the feel and sense of movement as it should, but the other features like the bass line and melodies and stuff start taking over. It's a bit of fun. These hats, you know, again, just finding the frequencies that I don't need. Relative panning and delay. We'll go through the sends and reverbs. We'll go through the sends and returns towards the end. Probably should have done it at the start. For this here, so this was a channel that I resampled, and I've resampled this again from that channel and put a chorus on it, and I could have put a stereo delay to give that width without the modulation, which is kind of what I wanted initially. I wanted the spatial dynamics of what a chorus does without having the modulation on it, but then I kind of just stumbled across it at first and figured out the technique of doing a 2040 room delay on the channel itself. But by the time I got there, I really liked the sound of that the chorus gave this a very unique sound. And then without, so it was discovered by pure accident. Sorry. And again, two EQs, an EQ here coming into the chorus, and then a further EQ afterwards coming out to, this affects the input, and then this just cleans up the output a little bit more with some compression. These are the hats, nothing too serious on as far as EQing goes. Compression, or compress differently. 3 different samples, 4 different samples. I mean, all EQ'd differently. See, this has little to no compression whatsoever. Just volume control, really. Could have used a utility. That's all right, just panning differences. Better fit them together. Moving on. What do we have here? We have the clap. On the group, yep. Clap. Another clap. See, I'm really not overdoing anything, really. Just everything's pretty vanilla, pretty laid back. Nothing over the top. We've spoken through the reverbs, you know, just finding the right input, sensible diffusion, high density. This is a little vocal channel again, so chose that section for the input. You see the decay time. In the synths, moving down, we have the driving bass line. Nothing too over the top, slight mixing inside of the VST itself. And the main thing that I can point out is the use of the phaser. I've turned the rate right down because I didn't want the movement of it going in and out of phase. I just wanted the initial sound that it gave by splitting the signal. And I've used this in the distortion here. Instead of using an EQ to sweep out the unwanted frequencies, I've done it inside the distortion. I think that's, see, there's no drive, it's completely in the mix, but I think I've done that just a personal choice, save time. I can EQ it in there as well as distorting it. So without, it's a lot more aggressive. And then with, very, very subtle. But it also gives a very good kick. Very good punch, I should say. Moving down, yeah, okay, so I worked with, we can delete these because they're not in use. Just working with grouping a little bit, playing around with it. Not even using those channels, so we shall move on. What do we have here? You can see I've played around with the effects inside the actual VST itself a little bit. Nothing over the top. Nothing over the top. Let's find something fun. Okay, yeah, we'll talk about this. So from the synthesizer itself, I've put this built-in plugin in, and what it does is it automatically splits the signal into a parallel signal, and on the chain it has filtration that automatically filters depending on the depending on the attack coming in, and the echo, what it's done, so it's in sync, so it's playing a quarter note difference, but the phase has been shifted a little bit. And I'll correct myself if I'm wrong on this, but the blue line there is the right speaker and the yellow line is the left speaker. There could be the other way around. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head, but from memory, that's what I believe it is. And they've put it a little bit out of phase, so the same signal is being delayed at the same time, but one is starting at a separate point than the other, and it really just kind of gives a wonky sound that also seems to fit. Yeah, that delay, it just really spreads out nicely. Some simple compression. And then the good thing about doing this or using a chain like this is because you have it in parallel, you can really play around and do some very experimental stuff in the chain, and you have a lot more room to play with, because at the end of the day, you can blend them together and you can hide whatever you do behind here. You can press the absolute hell out of it, make it real chunky, make it real noisy, and still be able to have the dry signal prominent with a clear sound with that underlying crunch to it. But as you see, as far as the dry wet rack goes, it's more dry. It's more wet than dry, meaning that the processing that's done in this chain is just a little bit louder than the dry signal, which is fine. And side chain compression onto the side chain just to give that pulse feeling. Yeah, and then EQing, nothing over the top. A little bit of auto pan, but we can explain that better here. So this is a noise sweep, noise riser that I've generated. I've just used a specific noise coming out, and then due to noise being all frequencies at the same time, you need two of these filters, one high pass, one low pass. And by doing that, you can really start to shape and modulate and move the sound yourself by getting rid of the frequencies you need as it builds, and you see one will be sweeping up, the other sweeps all the way up and then down and cuts. And whilst that's happening, this auto pan is increasing in amount and rate. Oh, sorry, the blue is left and the yellow is right. See, corrected myself. Yeah, the rate and the amount of the pan itself is increasing, and that just builds intensity on its own alongside a heavily sidechained. And you see, if you notice that as towards the end of the clip, I raise the threshold here, and that just makes it kind of blend everything together. It stops becoming a pulse and it starts taking over the whole build itself. Like we'll play it from just where it starts to loosen up on the threshold.
I had something wrong with my brain.
You see how it really starts to take over. And the same here. Nothing too over the top. I will put a link to some of the techniques that I've spoken about in this down below, and also in my blog, so go check that out. I'll put a link to the whole song, which is up now on SoundCloud.